When I think about the candidates that I interview, what they remember isn't the applicant tracking system process that they followed when they applied for a position with one of my clients. What they remember is my follow-ups, how I treated them through the interview process. Did I give them good feedback during and after? Did I not ghost them? Okay. Did I treat them well through the process? Did I follow up with them afterwards? That's what they remember. They remember my transparency and they remember my honesty. They remember how I made them feel.
Hi, I'm Kortney Harmon, Director of Industry Relations at Crelate. Welcome to another episode of the Full Desk Experience. Hey everyone, in case you missed it, we recently hosted a live virtual event, and it was one for the books. We brought together some of the best thought leaders in the recruiting and staffing industry for 2 full days of real, no-fluff conversations and what's actually working right now. From building trust with clients, to using AI without losing your edge, to growing revenue through relationships. These sessions were absolutely incredible, and we didn't want you to miss out. So we turned every single session into its own episode. And over the coming weeks, we're dropping them one by one right here. Each episode is a standalone session from the event. So whether you're tuning in for the first time or you were there live and you want to revisit all of your favorites, there's something for you. Stay tuned. You're going to want to hear from every single one of our speakers. Trust me. Enjoy. For anyone who doesn't know, I am also going to put Denise's LinkedIn here in the chat. Please be sure to connect with her.
Please do.
Because she does so much. She actually has been in the industry for over 30 years. She is a CEO of TopSource Talent, LLC, a minority women-owned staffing firm based out of Phoenix. She specializes in talent acquisition, workforce solutions, and she's also the host of the Talking TA podcast, where she brings HR and recruiting leadership together to share what's actually working. So hopefully she's going to be telling us just that as she's talking automation as smart relationships win. So she's going to be giving us some great information. And this session is about the competitive edge you already have if you're using it right. So please welcome Denise. Denise, thank you so much for spending time out of your busy day to come talk to us today.
Gosh, I wasn't expecting that.
Oh, I love it. And I'm super excited that our paths have crossed and we actually got to bring you on the podcast because I know you, as well as many other people that we've had on here so far, do so much for the industry and just try to give back and really have great insights. So thank you for all that you do in the industry.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. I really do. Yes, I've been in this industry a really long time. And, there are, a lot of issues that are coming up right now and concerns about, our AI. We're being chased by it, or are we chasing it? Right. So, I just want to kind of put some people at ease, I think, with this, but also to kind of just, center us a little bit here on what is important in every industry, right? So this conversation is about relationship intelligence, but before I jump into it, let me tell you a little bit about who I am. So it was in 1986, I was working for the newspaper, Arizona Republic, Arizona's largest newspaper. And I was working in classified ads. I was working in sales. I was a sales associate for them. And this was a time when, paper routes were still a big deal. And people were using the newspaper classified ad section to post jobs. Employers were posting jobs there. And people were looking for jobs. And it was funny because the Sunday paper was like the biggest paper for all classified ads, whether you were selling a boat or a car, or your house, or advertising for anything, but the want ads, we called them, was one of the largest sections. And people, if you were a job seeker, you would go out and buy that paper because you would keep it all week long. And you would use your highlighter pen and you'd be circling, jobs that you were interested in. It's different today because now we're using our mobile phones and our laptops and our iPads, to swipe, Back then, the swiping was the paper, itself, and of course, getting newspaper ink all over your fingers, which was fun. But it's funny, but people would actually use the newspaper, and they would hand deliver their resumes to the addresses that were in the help wanted ads, or they would mail them. So it was a little bit more of a complicated scenario, I guess, when we were doing that. But anyway, about 2 years in, I gotta make sure I'm hitting the right slide here. About 2 years in, I attended a funeral, and I happened to bump into an acquaintance. And my acquaintance and I were chit-chatting. We hadn't seen each other in a long time. And I told him I was working for the newspaper as in sales. And he mentioned to me that he was a recruiter for an executive search firm. So what came to mind for me was my own father, who had been a paratrooper with the 82nd Airborne Division of the U.S. Army, and rest his soul. Anyway, so I conjured up this vision of an Uncle Sam poster, the I Want You for the U.S. Army poster. I don't know why, but anyway, that was what came to mind for me. And so it was about maybe 2 or 3 days later after the funeral that this acquaintance contacted me. And he mentioned to me that, he had thought about our conversation. And he asked me, would you be interested in talking to me further about a potential career in, we called it recruiting back then. Talent acquisition was not a term yet. So I said, well, maybe, and he kind of gave me a little bit more information about what he did as a recruiter. And he verified for me, because I asked right up front, is this for the military or is this for the Army? And he said, no, this is something completely different. He said, a lot of people think that. But anyway, honestly, I'm just thinking right now, I don't recall when the executive search industry really started. I think it was back maybe about 20 years before that, or maybe 10 or 15 years before that. Anyway, so he clarified that for me, but he asked me to come in and meet with him and his boss, the president of the search firm. So I did. We had a great conversation. By the end of our meeting, they offered me a position. And so little did I know when I left that meeting that this was the start of a really long career in talent acquisition. So here we are 38 years later. And again, my name is Denise Chaffin. And like Kortney said, I'm the CEO of TopSource Talent, and also a host now for the Talking TA podcast. And we started that about 3 years ago. When I stepped into this industry, we had certain industry tools that we were using, but honestly, the tools that the relationship that these tools supported, were really dynamic. They really were. And, today I think our focus is more on the technology. And I think that with AI again, embedded in our industry now, there's a lot of concern, about the tools that we're using. But, a lot of times now we're asked, because we are using so much technology, it's what is your tech stack? Anyway, so our tech stack, as we call it, a little tongue tied there, in this industry back in the 80s was really basic. We had, let me go ahead and switch slides again. We had a desk phone, landline phone, as you see there. We had a fax machine. We thought that we were really high tech with a fax machine. And then I had what I called my wheel of fortune. For me, my wheel of fortune was actually this little Ferris wheel of 3x5 index cards, as you can see there. That's really what it looked like. And I would stuff business cards in it. It was in alphabetical order. Everything imaginable was in this Rolodex, because this was where I stored all of my contacts. I guess you could, kind of compare it to a non-digital primitive version of the early cloud. And this Wheel of Fortune, not to be confused with the game show, where Vanna White is turning the letters, was my business. I mean, that was, what I referred to all the time. And, honestly, it worked. It really did. Because we had back then, like I said, a landline. Our business was built on conversations in person and on the phone. We were using our landline to call people, to set up meetings, to recruit people, to talk to clients. We did not have yet the email. We didn't have text messages. We didn't have the internet. None of that was around. So kind of think about that for a minute. If you could go back that many years, would you have welcomed this kind of a this level of connection with people. It was actually kind of fun. It was different. It was a different era. So moving forward, one of the things that happened, when I started this business is there was two kinds of recruiting back then, and still are. It's still this way even today. We had what we called corporate recruiting, and we had what we called agency recruiting. And of course, I was on the agency side. And on the agency side of corporate recruiting, it was kind of messy. It was disorganized. I mean, we had manila folders everywhere. Again, we weren't using technology. And with the corporate side, I think it was a little more structured. It was very slow. It was very deliberate. But again, there was no technology. We were still just using telephones, and we were using in-person meetings. We had a lot of lunches with people. We did a lot of happy hours, did a lot of on-site visits. We brought people into our offices. It was really quite amazing. Anyway, one of the things I wanted to bring up was the fact that we were also attending conferences back then. And I think that what happened was with conferences, I think that it gave us an opportunity to meet up with people, have conversations with them. And you're going to kind of see me draw some parallels between then and now. And it's kind of fun to do because a lot has changed. And then in some respects, a lot hasn't changed. So anyhow, going back to our conferences, this is before smartphones, of course. This is before email, before text messages, all that kind of fun stuff. Our relationships that we had with people were actually a lot deeper. There was a lot more to our relationships. We didn't have the transactional kind of stuff that we have now because we have a lot more context with people now with technology. One of the things that happened, I recall, at a conference that I attended about 3 years ago, because I started going to conferences again after COVID, because COVID really got a lot of attention for bringing people back together, once we were allowed to get back together. And conferences started up again. So we kind of went through this period without them, especially during the whole COVID, the first 2 or 3 years of COVID. But anyway, when I started going back to conferences, the one thing that I noticed was I had incredible conversations with people. I was doing some interviews for the podcast, and I remember meeting this guy, and it was his first time attending a conference. And I asked him, I said, "Why are you here? Why are you attending this conference?" And he said, "Well, actually," he said, "I came here. This is my first time." He said, "And it's really incredible to me that when I am talking to people, I'm actually going to remember them better, I think, than I do, talking to them through a Slack channel or a text message or email." He said, "Because I'm meeting them face to face." I thought, wow, that's pretty, observant, pretty perspective. And I told him, I said, that brings up a really good point. When you are meeting people at face to face, those are your closest connections. So I loved him saying that to me. Another woman I spoke with at another conference, maybe another year later, she's a CEO of a company that is a big ATS company. And she said, "I love coming to conferences because it's kind of like the new water cooler," which is why I picked this picture. It's kind of like the new water cooler, where everyone together. She's, "I can meet my vendors. I can meet my clients. I can meet other people in my organization that might be working at different locations." So it was, kind of great to get her perspective on it as well. But it kind of just drove home that point, that we really desire human connection. And so people really want to have those conversations. So when you look back in the 80s, before technology, and when you look back now, post COVID, and how people are like re-engaging, there's, we can draw some parallels there, right? It was an exciting time. There was still, as the technology kind of picked up, it was just, my goodness, moving so fast. Anyway, moving forward. So one of the things too that's happened, over time, because of technology, I kind of have to ask this question, on our digital systems that we have now, and with all of the technology connections that we are engaged with, are our digital systems remembering our relationships that matter? And that's coming up for me because I believe that we still need that human connection. And I try as hard as I can to get on a plane every so often to go and meet with clients and to meet face to face, with people I'm potentially going to interview or present to a client if I can, if it's for a company, or attend job fairs. That was another thing. I loved attending job fairs, way back in the day. And I think that we still have them from time to time, but I don't see those as much as we used to have. But the one business practice that I brought into my career early on was cultivating and developing relationships with salespeople and sales team. Salespeople are the best resources for any industry. They know their clients, they know the competitors, they know who's buying, they know which companies are expanding, which companies are contracting. So I always like to cultivate those relationships with salespeople because we would exchange information. I do believe that talent acquisition in itself is a sales oriented industry. We're kind of like, I've always used the analogy, we're kind of like real estate agents, we're instead of, just, trying to sell somebody a house, you're also trying to work with, the buyer and the seller at the same time. Well, it's kind of the same thing with talent acquisition. You're working with your clients and you're working with the candidates that you're bringing into your clients' organizations. So anyway, with the sales teams, though, I mean, having those relationships has paid dividends over the years. A lot of these people I've stayed in contact with for many, many years, because I've been in this business and I'm still working. A lot of people are retiring. I'm not. But anyway, this is what I'm referring to when I talk about relationship intelligence. Because relationship intelligence really, and I'll go into a little bit more in more detail as I share some of these other slides. But it's just having that knowledge, that innate knowledge, about human connection. So going back though to our technology, does anybody remember dial-up? Dial-up was our first connection to the internet, and the sounds that it made. You had to have a landline telephone, for yeah, that sounds so. In fact, I was going to try to actually have the sound on here, but it wasn't going to work with these slides. Anyhow, yes, I can still remember the sound as well. But anyhow, with the dial-up and or the internet connection, it was our first foray into the whole world of technology. Of course, it's never been the same. We had, this was actually though, even though we had the technology with the internet, I'm just going back here in my own memory bank. It was slow to start. Okay, so just keep that in mind. It wasn't like everybody had computers on their desks just because the internet had started. That was not the case at all. In 1991 was the very first website that went up. And I know it doesn't seem that long ago, especially think about it. From the very first website to now is how many years? I guess I need to do the math here, but 35 years. Anyway, we have, by 1993, we had full access to the internet. So just in 2 years, the first website, though, is what I wanted to share with you is the World Wide Web. And it was a publicly accessible service to everyone. And so it took people time to get modems, to get the dial-up, to have the extra line installed in their home, to get computers. A lot of people didn't even have computers yet, right? So it took time for all of this to happen. But anyway, by 1993, the internet was accessible to everyone. And then as we kind of rolled forward here, we had the dot-com era came, I want to say it was maybe 1995 was when the dot-com era started. So once we had the internet, things just like flew forward. So the dot-com era was an interesting time. There were a lot of new companies starting. They all wanted to be online. Everybody wanted a .com after their name. Any new idea, any new business went up on the new internet that we had. The problem though was there were a lot of companies that didn't make it. So it was about 2000. In fact, it was in January of 2000. We had Super Bowl 34 And Super Bowl 34 actually had a number of companies. I think it was like 20% of the companies that advertised for that particular Super Bowl were .com companies. Unfortunately, though, a couple of months later, the .com bubble that we had built burst, and a lot of companies just didn't make it. Some of the companies that did, though, are companies you would recognize: Amazon, eBay, Google was another one, Yahoo, I think, was one. So there were several that made it through. But unfortunately, by 2002, a lot of these companies were hurting because in 2001, the end of 2001, we had 9/11 happen, which really affected the stock market. So you had the bubble burst and you had 9/11. So 2002 was a tough year. Let me get around to I've got a few notes here. Oh, anyway, moving forward. So around this time, my little Rolodex, I kept it. Don't get me wrong. I kept it until 2020. I was not going to get rid of that thing. It held too much information. And I always thought, oh, what if something happens to, the internet? So I held on to it, but I did kind of shove it into a drawer because by this time now I've got a desktop computer. I have my modem. I'm online. I'm sending emails. It's all, fabulous, right? But as we kind of went forward, other things were happening as well. So now we're doing digital networking. And I can recall in 2000 going to a conference with a number of my engineering colleagues. I was working for a semiconductor company at the time. So there's this group of engineers that I had gone to this conference, and another recruiter, my friend Yvonne. So she and I went to this conference. It was up in the Bay Area. And while we were there, it was a very technical conference. A lot of these engineers were I swear to God, this picture looks exactly like how we were all standing around. They were showing us how to use our phones to connect with each other digitally without a business card, which it was fun. It was amazing to be able to introduce us to this idea that we could actually store our contacts in our cell phones now, not just on our desktops, but now in our cell phones as well. So, I mean, look, just in a couple of years, how this technology is rolling forward, right? And the only problem with that, though, is I still like the business cards. In fact, I was at a conference in September of this last year. There was a big electronics conference here in Phoenix. And I came back with a stack of business cards, just 2-3 inches thick. People are still using them. I think that we have learned, the capability of digital networking. I think it's great. I think it's great for storing information, storing our contacts. But sometimes we just still, I think, like the tactical feel of business cards and just like having them. Because, I mean, obviously, I'm not the only one taking them to conferences if I'm coming back here to my office with a stack of them, right? So some habits die hard, which is fine. And like I said, as you can tell, I kind of hold on to things, my Rolodex, business cards. So you're learning a little bit about me here. So by this time too, the recruiting accelerates. Oh my gosh. Now we're moving faster. We're connecting with our hiring managers, our business units. Now we're doing a lot more things transactionally through the internet. But now job boards and ATS platforms happen. So it was in 1996. Let me go back here. Yeah. So anyway, it was in 1996. We had the very first. I want to make sure I've got the right slide here. Sorry. Nope, this is right. So it was in 1996. We had the very first applicant tracking system. It was called Resumix, and I was working for Motorola at the time, and it was really quite amazing. Now we could send resumes directly to our hiring managers, and people, instead of, remember back, I told you about the story about the newspaper and people would hand deliver their resumes or they'd mail them in. Not anymore. Now they were sending them in digitally. They were still using the newspaper, but now there was an address where you could literally digitally send your resume in. So now people were creating them online. This was new, sending them in to us. And now we're able to review them and then forward them on to the hiring managers for the first time. And this was like a huge savings. When we talk about right now AI, and we talk about AI taking over our jobs, AI is not going to take our jobs our jobs are going to change though, just like they did back then. So instead of physically picking up a stack of resumes and hand delivering them to the hiring managers around the office, of course, I did get a lot more exercise back then doing that. But now we could just go ahead and send them off and kind of keep moving forward with our day-to-day work. We didn't have to stop and do that manual, delivery of these resumes. So that was really pretty cool. So Resumix was the first one on the scene. And that was in 1996 I think it was in 1999, I started using monster.com. So this is now when the job boards are coming up. Job boards were great. Monster came up in 1999. We were using Career Builder as well in 1995. That wasn't, we didn't use that in our office that much yet, not until I started working for on Semiconductor. And that's when I think we were using Career Builder there. But right afterwards, so those were the first two on the scene, was Monster and Career Builder. And then after that, we had hotjobs.com, dice.com, ladders. Indeed came around later. That was in 2004. But anyway, so we were using these, and not only that, but we are integrating them now with our email. We are able to, integrate the ATS, the job boards, and our email. And it was huge. But look at the timeline here, how quickly that happened. So again, drawing the parallels between then and now, because we're doing the same thing with AI. Things are happening a lot faster. We're trying to, learn this new technology as we're trying to learn to incorporate it into our day-to-day business, right? So, but fear not. We made it through then. We'll make it through now. So I'm just here to tell you that. Okay, now all right, it's maybe the late 90s, early 2000s. Now we've got on-the-go recruiting. So mobile meets the ATS, mobile meets email. We're now starting to, do things with our cell phones. And again, with the smartphones, they came out in 2007. I think that we were actually doing things digitally before then a little bit, but it was in 2007 that we really took off, with the mobile applications and starting to do things with our phone. And of course, nothing, we can never go back from that now. Right? We're all hooked to our cell phones. Anyway, so we had on-the-go recruiting. What that's done for us, it has given us, it's expanded our outreach to people. And in fact, I love what Sean was saying earlier about, I'm sorry, it wasn't Sean. It was Shad. I'm sorry, Shad. That was a great presentation, by the way. But what Shad was sharing earlier, though, too, about, the outreach. I think it was, we have that now. We had hiring process is faster. Everything is just speedy. But what happens though to our relationships? Let's go back to that for a moment. They became super transactional because we had so many more. My little Rolodex that held 500 cards in it. Those are all my contacts. Now we've got thousands of contacts. How are we going to stay in touch with all these people? Right? Because there's so many of them. And we want to do a good job staying in touch with them. But, our devices have just kept getting smarter and smarter over the years. Does anybody here remember this Jeopardy 3-day challenge? So IBM put their AI, and I'm going to go ahead and introduce AI here, up to compete with these two top contestants for Jeopardy. AI won. Watson was the IBM system. Watson won. Actually, Watson won $1 million, but I think after everything was said and done, Watson walked away with about $38,000. Or no, about $38,000. I think I'd have to check on that. Sorry, thought I had that number in my head. Anyway, so let's fast forward. So now, let's look at today. We have over 100 applicant tracking systems today. So you look at 1996, you look at 30 years later. In 30 years, we've gone from one ATS, as we call them, applicant tracking system, to now over 100 platforms that we're all using today that are all active. And it's really quite amazing. That's 3 a year over the last 30 years. 3 new companies. So when you think of it, it's like, we get confused, we get baffled. It's daunting, right? And I love too what Shad was talking about, when we're talking to customers. I can't even imagine working for one of the ATS companies with all that competition out there. I mean, and especially right now with AI driving so much of the back end, processes for ATSs. Here's the thing though, and I'm going to dive into this a little bit further now. Have we replaced relationship building with efficiency with all of this? Because that is a concern. And it's something that, has been really kind of in the front of what I do for a while now. We're in a very people-oriented business. But with all of this technology, what are we losing? And I had brought it up in an earlier slide. Our relationships have become super transactional with people because we're trying to keep up with so many. How do we prioritize our relationships and prioritize our contacts? If you think about the notes that we used, a lot of us, when I was first in this business and before technology happened, it was really quite interesting because, all those notes we took, we hand wrote them. And honestly, I retained a lot more of that information, handwriting it, I think, on those Rolodex cards and typing it into a digital format, probably because there were less contacts at the time as well. And now there's a lot more of them. Plus, how much is the technology doing for us versus doing it ourselves? And I had a podcast yesterday with Dan Burris, and he is a keynote speaker. And we were talking about this. We were talking about the fact that, people, how are we retaining the information? People who are using AI too much, to do a lot of their presentations or do a lot of their work for them. How are they going to learn and retain information if they're allowing AI to do a lot of it for them? So where are we going to draw the line here? AI is helpful. We need it. But at the same time, all of those old notes that I took back then, back in the 80s and 90s, seriously, I can still remember what some of those notes look like. Where with digital technology, it's a little different, but we need them, right? Because now we've got speed versus memory. So automation has increased speed, but it has reduced our connection with people. And we need to kind of, get back to that. This is important. We need to find this balance between connection and between the speed of technology, especially now with AI. So what is relationship intelligence, right? It's not a buzzword. Relationship intelligence is not, it's not something that we have to practice. It comes to us naturally. It is technology enabled, but it's guided by us as humans. And I think that that's a really important factor here in this, because now we get to look at it from a kind of, a higher viewpoint. So 3 things happen here, with automation. We have data intelligence that tells us what has happened, right? Gives us data on things that have happened in the past. We have automation that tells us what to do next and points us in the right direction, which is great. But then we have relationship intelligence that tells us who and what matters. But we also have now automation fatigue, and we need to address that. So I know with Candace, probably our clients as well. And I loved your presentation, Shad. It was really great. And you brought some of these points up. But candidates, when we're dealing with candidates, there is so much out there now, like I was talking about with all these ATSs, with all of these job boards, with, you've got LinkedIn now, you've got Slack, you've got you've got the Indeed, okay. So go and just taking a step back here too. So we had LinkedIn started in 2003, and then in 2004 we had I want to say it was YouTube, but so you had LinkedIn, YouTube, Indeed, Twitter, and Facebook. That was the other one. 5 of them within a 3-year period they hit the market. And we're working with all of these different platforms. So yeah, I can relate to the girl with her head on the desk, because it's oh my God, how did I, contact, John Doe yesterday? Did I contact him through Slack, through email, through LinkedIn? Oh, I don't even remember. There's just so many. So, but candidates are also, and our clients are also getting a lot of messages from us. There's just a lot of stuff that comes in through email and through LinkedIn. And how many of these messages are real messages? How many of them are bulk email campaigns? Because we can tell a difference. We can tell as people when we're being pursued or being processed. And I just think that happens for a lot of us. So what about that? How are we going to navigate and manage that? Trust. So the one thing that I have learned in my career, throughout my career, is that speed builds pipelines, but trust builds influence. So when people can trust that we are contacting them directly, that we're not just mass emailing them, and it's not to say we shouldn't have campaigns. We need to have campaigns, but then how are we going to follow up? And what are those campaigns going to look like? We need to take a really serious look at that. Do you guys remember this little guy here, Wally? It was a movie. It was in 2008, Wally was this little robot, and he worked alone, and he was like 700 years doing the same thing. And he was, working, I think that he was processing parts or something like that. Anyway, he finally reached out and made a connection. And even back then, in 2008, when this film was done, you figure that was 18 years ago. Even then, he needed that human connection to kind of make things change. So the human connection that he made was what mattered. And we still need that because the trust builds influence. When you reach out to people directly, whether you're reaching out to clients or you reach out to colleagues or, in my case, candidates I'm trying to reach, who are those people that will answer my calls all these years later, even if I don't have something direct, or even if they don't need me to support them like a client? Do they pick up the phone and take my call? If so, that's influence. Influence is we build that over a period of time. Trust is influence. Yeah. Anyway, automation though, without memory. Let's talk about that for a moment. So automation without memory and process without connection erodes trust. And I think that what happens is if we wind up, like I was mentioning, we wind up really focusing too much on the automation, and we focus more on, the mass emailing or the big campaigns, and we're not making those direct contacts with people. We're not having those one-on-one conversations. It is going to erode trust, and people aren't going to trust us as much. We want to make sure that we are still building trust, building influence, because behavior changes. The more that we connect with people, behaviors change. If behaviors change, trust changes, influence changes. It's a chain reaction, right? So let's go to the next. What people remember about us, talking about trust, talking about influence. When I think about the candidates that I interview, what they remember isn't the applicant tracking system process that they followed when they applied for a position with one of my clients. What they remember is my follow-ups, how I treated them through the interview process. Did I give them good feedback during and after? Did I not ghost them? Okay. Oh, we could get into a whole conversation about ghosting. But anyway, did I, treat them well through the process? Did I follow up with them afterwards? That's what they remember. They remember my transparency, and they remember my honesty. They remember how I made them feel. Same thing with clients. With clients, they'll remember maybe an extra step that I took, or extra time that I took to maybe craft an award-winning job description for them that they were getting stuck with. Or maybe I helped an indecisive candidate, get to the finish line. Those are the types of things that a client will remember. Also, with our referrals, people who help us with job searches, people who give us names, people who share information about the competition. they're going to remember the gestures that like if I give them a little gift, if I, give them a Starbucks card, or I give them a commission, whatever it is, they're going to remember how I made them feel, during and before, during, and after that whole process. These are the things, and not just how they feel, but how we make them feel about themselves. So let's look at our relationship ecosystem. In our industry, in the recruiting industry, we've got, of course, our candidates, our clients, our referrals, and our peers. These people, though, are not a database. These people they are our community. They are our ecosystem. So how are we going to treat them? How are we going to stay in contact with them? How do we kind of keep the ball rolling and keep those relationships active, keep them keep them connected with us, keep them connected with each other, because we are connectors in the industry I'm in. And I used the analogy earlier about real estate agents. We're all connectors. We connect people to each other. And I love too what Shad said earlier. Even if you don't have a job for somebody, even if you don't have a particular a candidate to give to a client, but they need help with something, just giving them your help, connecting them to the right person, giving them a lead, giving them a suggestion, just being willing to help people. That is part of our ecosystem. That is part of what we do. And I love the fact that I got to listen to Shad's presentation, because I kept going, yep, that's what I'm going to be talking about as well. It's important. And you cannot do enough to drive these points home. So now we have the ATS, all right? And I told you we've got, over 100 of them now, right? So let's reframe it. So let's take and use the ATS now as a memory system, as a relationship memory system. All those cards I was talking about earlier, all the little notes that I used to take in my Rolodex, now I'm putting them in here. Now we need the ATS to kind of become our memory for us, to help remind us when we need to reach out to people. It also needs to remind us about maybe milestones that people are making. I love the fact that LinkedIn does that. And I do. And I really think that LinkedIn is, even though it's a monopoly, has really provided for us a great ecosystem on staying together, being able to watch when people, hit new milestones, a new job, a new location, a new title, a promotion, or if there's layoffs. How many people have we seen go through layoffs? And again, reaching out to people that we know that have been affected by layoffs. And if nothing else, maybe just helping them with their resume, helping them, giving them some suggestions on places they can go. One thing that I have been sharing with people who've been affected by layoffs are fringe industries that they can reach out to. There are a lot of fringe industries that people don't even think about that might need their help. So offering, to counsel and coach people and give advice, there's nothing in it, or nothing to it, I should say, in terms of just offering your support. So, but these are the types of things, these types of notes need to go into an ATS. What someone's geographic preferences are, what their timing is. Oh my gosh, let's talk about timing, right? Because you have a lot of people who can't make a switch right now. They've got kids, that are going to graduate from high school at the end of the year, or their spouse is, working in a position, that they need to stay. And so they can't make a geographic move. Just all those types of things that needs to go into the ATS. We need our ATSs now to become a relationship memory system to help us so that we're not so transactional, with our relationships. So I like this one because this is kind of coming up. This is a new term, a newer term, I should say. So after every search that we do for a client, after every hire that we have, we need to ask ourselves a couple of questions. Who are the people the other stellar candidates that didn't get selected? Because oftentimes I know for myself, if I present candidates for a position, I'm not presenting just one. I'll present 3 or 4, maybe even 5, depending on what the position is. But only one person's going to get picked because there's only one position. So what happens to those other candidates, right? Those are the people we need to be keeping in contact with. Those are the people who we need to stay on top of, because oh my gosh, they're placeable, number one. Number two, they're in our network now. We've had conversations with them. We don't want to just forget them. In the industry, they're calling them silver medalists now. So how do we stay in contact with them, right? Follow-up strategy. We're going to have intentional follow-ups that we need to build meaningful relationships. But this is where AI can help us. AI and, combined with the ATS technology can help us get there. We can have periodic check-ins. And again, these notes can be notes that we write ourselves and have AI send them out for us at a particular time. Again, congratulating people on their milestones. Any kind of thoughtful touch point, people when they get married, have children. There was one woman that I did a podcast interview with not too long ago, and she said that she keeps in contact with kids who graduate from high school. She still makes those notes, but she keeps them, stored digitally. But she's still making notes and reminders. She has reminders come to her. So-and-so's kid is graduating from high school, or they're getting married, or they're getting ready to move, or they're getting ready to, have their in-laws come and live with them, whatever the case may be. That's how she's keeping in touch with them. It's not on work-related stuff. It's more on personal-related stuff. So there you go. All right. Now, speaking of relationship memory, so let's talk about relationship management. So let's manage some of the relationships in a way that it doesn't sound so, I don't know, kind of boring, I guess. But when you build relationships with people, it's quite it's quite amazing when you do stay in contact with them, what you'll find over time. So I'm going to give you a story. I mean, one of the things that door is on here because we just have to keep the door open for everybody, right? And that's why I put it on there. But there was a woman, it was in 2008, who I had recruited for a software configuration engineer position for one of my clients. It was a DoD or Department of Defense client in Southern California. And they wanted somebody, they were very rigid, that they wanted somebody who had a completed bachelor's degree. And that was more prevalent back then. I think we're seeing it lighten up a little bit now. But anyway, so I had recruited Erin, and she was still working on her degree. She still had 1 year left. And so the company wouldn't hire her. They interviewed her. They loved her. I mean, she was a good culture fit. She had all the right skills. They saw, a career path for her. But they said, our requirements are she's got to have a completed degree. So I kind of, said, all right, sorry, Erin, go ahead and finish your degree, but let's stay in touch. And I did stay in touch with her. And I stayed in touch with her the whole year. So what happened was we continued to interview people, and we interviewed several people actually over the next year, but they weren't Erin. They really wanted someone like Erin. And there was something about her that just resonated. And again, it was, I think, more of a connection, just that, collaboration. They really liked her. Anyhow, going back. So a year later, 12 months later, we still had not hired anybody for that position. We interviewed several people, but never hired anybody. Anyway, Erin was finishing her degree. So because I had stayed in contact with her, she and I, were staying up to speed on the position for my client. And I told them, I said, she's getting ready to finish her degree. And quite truthfully, there are other people pursuing her because there were other companies that knew she was getting ready to finish her degree. But luckily, because that relationship was there, she followed us, and they gave her an offer contingent on her degree being completed, which it was going to be completed within a couple of weeks. And she accepted their position with my client. And so it was a happy ending. It was great. It was unfortunate. It took, it was delayed by a year because of this education requirement. But like I said, I think things are loosening up a little bit now. But going back though to her, she was one example of somebody I stayed in contact with. And even though there were other companies pursuing her, she had this relationship with me. So it was fabulous because, again, happy ending. So let's talk about this. Let's talk about the trust metrics then, of re-engaging with people, of referrals. And then we have, what we call now boomerang hires. And boomerang hires are people who leave a company and then maybe go someplace else, but you stay in contact with them. And let's say you're working for the same client that they left, 2 or 3 years ago, But let's say now the new client or that client has a new executive team, and maybe they left because they didn't like the management. And this actually happened several times throughout my career. One time that comes to mind right now is another semiconductor company. They were looking for a ceramics engineer, and they were having a really hard time because these people had to have these specific skills, of course. But anyway, they wound up asking me, to do this search. And I went and I asked them, I said, well, did you take somebody back who used to work for the company? And they said, oh, hands down, of course. So I reached out to a few people, and I got this one guy in particular who had left. I asked him, I said, why did you leave? And he said, well, I didn't like the manager I was working for. Turns out that manager was no longer there. So he was willing to take a step and come back. And as far as I know, he's still there. So they rehired him. And those are called boomerang hires. And we've had several of those. I had one client who wanted to bring back their female tech staff that had left. So there was a lot of technical, expertise, if you would, that had left the company, and I don't know why they left. There was different reasons there, but they wanted to increase for diversity reasons, increase their female tech staff. So we reached out to them and brought some of them back. So it was pretty great. But again, the re-engagement, the trust, that we've established with these people, when they leave. Something else that came up yesterday in a podcast was the fact that when we are, or actually it was 2 days ago in a different podcast, when we are allowing people to leave our organization, or again, during layoffs, are we doing pulse or are we doing surveys, exit surveys or any kind of pulse surveys while they're still there? I mean, how many companies are doing that? Everybody should be doing it. Every company should be doing a survey when somebody comes in after like 30 days, 90 days to see how the new employee likes their position. They should be surveying them every 6 months or once a year at least. How are things going? Tell us X, Y, Z, how you feel about your job, your management, the executive team, the company culture, all that type of thing. You need to be tracking that stuff. And then when somebody does leave, they need an exit interview. That way, why they left. Because if you need to bring them back, then you've got all of that data there. So I'm hoping that more and more companies are going to do that, because I think that it really helps with trust metrics. I think that also too, less people will leave if they know that you're checking in with them and not just taking information from them, but actionable information, things that you are going to change as a result of some of the feedback that they give you. So have you hired someone years after meeting them? Yes, probably. So that's another thing that, I think is very important. Oftentimes we'll meet somebody, but maybe we don't need that person yet in our company or in our organization. But, what about 2 years from now, 3 years from now? If we've stayed in contact with those people and we know, where they're at, and what their timeline is for maybe making a move, that's so important. And again, I think the AI can help us. And I think this is where, the ATS companies, if they're using using AI for the right tasks, I think the relationship memory system is going to be huge. So the future, the best relationship stewards are going to win. They really are. I mean, hands down. As we are connecting with people and as we are developing relationships, and we're not going to be perfect at it. Nobody is. We're human, right? But again, technology driven, human guided. That I stick to that. So we don't just fill roles, we steward careers, and we steward relationships, right? Not just careers. So I think that is probably the important message here. And I would love to go up here and see some questions. Get off the phone. I love Sean Bell. Get off the phone. I need to check my email. That is good. And then CJ misses the BlackBerry. Actually, I heard something interesting about the BlackBerry. So I don't know who the founder of that company was, but when Apple first came out with the smartphone, the president of BlackBerry said, well, who wants to be watching, movies on such a small device? Little did he know that it was going to take off. He should have been a little smarter, and said, oh yeah, maybe we should incorporate that into our cell phones, right? I still have my BlackBerry Bold CJ brick breaker, FTW. I don't know what FTW means, but those are great. Any questions?
We'll leave it open if anybody has any questions for Denise. I know we have Anna backstage. Anna, I'll bring you on in a second. Give me a few. I love that. I literally, as soon as you said dial up AOL internet, like I remember our first computer. Like I literally was telling my kids that today or this week. My son was like about the computer and how spoiled they are at 12. And I'm like, do you know the first computer was like black with green writing? And he's like, really? I'm like, yeah, you thought black and white movies were bad, bud. That was a whole nother world.
Yeah, those were the DOS computers, right? Yeah.
I remember playing Oregon Trail on those bad boys whenever I was in elementary school.
Or WordPerfect. WordPerfect was the first.
Yes.
Yeah.
And now look at the speed that we're moving.
Oh, I know. But I'm like I was saying, though, I want to draw the parallels between then and now, because they're there. Definitely.
They are.
There's a lot of people, I hear a lot of fear all the time about AI. But, and I think part of, my mission here is to kind of, relax that fear. And so people aren't so worried about it because we can't, just like Dan Burris said yesterday, we can only look forward. The future is here. The future is going to keep going. There's nothing that we can do to stop it. Educating ourselves and making those comparisons, drawing those parallels between what happened 30 years ago and what's happening now, I think will help to kind of quell some of the fear that people have around AI.
Yeah, no, I agree. I love it. Denise, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your knowledge and your wisdom. If anybody has any questions for Denise, if you don't put them here, feel free to connect with Denise on LinkedIn, follow her podcast as well. So many wonderful speakers in this industry. Once again, Denise, thank you so very much for your.
Thank you, Kortney. Well, thank you for having me on. I so appreciate it.
That's a wrap on this episode. If this one got you thinking, just wait until you hear what's coming next. We're dropping a new session from the FDE Plus Q1 event every week. Each one a different speaker, a different topic, and a different angle on what really takes to build relationship-driven revenue in this industry right now. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next one. We'll see you there.